Anyway, moving on. What is shame? Why do we experience shame? Is it useful? Is it just a detriment? Shame exists to stop us crossing lines and getting rejected from other people or society. So if you're in a group of people and you come out with something wild and the whole group goes silent and kind of side-eyes you, that's that feeling, right? Is that, oh, I said something stupid that maybe I shouldn't have. And that's a good thing. That's a very healthy thing. That is conducive to a more fluid and decent society, I would say. So it helps us realize when we've done something wrong, and it is there to hopefully guide us to being better people. It's an unpleasant feeling, so what you do is avoid doing things that give you that unpleasant feeling. Very simple. Very constructive, actually. Without that, all of society would be a bunch of psychopaths. However, too much shame, that becomes damaging and goes the opposite way and makes us close ourselves off and just avoid social interactions altogether. Healthy shame says, I did something bad. Toxic shame, on the other hand, says, I am bad. Those are two very different things, and one leads to positivity, one leads to negativity. Without shame, people can become selfish, arrogant, or unwilling to admit when they have done something wrong. They'll pass blame because they haven't had that feeling of, oh, I feel bad because of that thing that I did, so it can't be me, it's got to be someone else, right? It's like a trigger in the mind that isn't functioning properly. With too much shame, on the other hand, people can become anxious and withdrawn and become afraid to be themselves, essentially. Ideally, you would not get rid of shame entirely, but use it as a warning sign. And that's all, and then move on from that moment, having learned how that interaction or that action made you feel. It wasn't nice, was it? So don't do it again. It's very simple. It's like our own inbuilt justice system. But there are certain people who react badly to shame in the sense that they become defensive or angry, or, like I previously mentioned, blaming other people because the wiring is off somehow. And really the bottom line is that shame is useful when it leads to change. That's the whole point of it. I don't think animals, wild animals, have shame. You know, it's a very human concept. And I don't really believe animals have the concept of right or wrong. It's just survival, really. Maybe dogs if you train them well enough, but again, that's just instilling them with human values. They don't inherently understand the difference between morally good or morally bad. So that's something that really separates us from animals. And if a person doesn't have that built into them, then they are basically no better than an orangutan. Shame gets treated like this toxic thing that we should just eradicate completely, which I don't think that's the right approach. If you had zero shame, you'd probably be unbearable to be around. And trust me, I have known people who, at least on the surface, appear to have no shame, and yeah, they can be quite obnoxious, to say the least. So the real question isn't how do we eliminate shame, but how do we stop it from screwing us over while still using it appropriately? So something I mentioned in a previous podcast is the concept of self-reflection or self-awareness, however you want to put it. And people who have this wiring about shame wired up back to front, and it doesn't work properly, they are also people who struggle to self-reflect. There's a correlation between those two kinds of people. There's a big crossover. And I find this fascinating because it makes sense, in a way, when you break it down. If someone has no ability to self-reflect, or they always think they're right, etc., then it would make sense that they can't acknowledge that they did something wrong and learn from that, using that feeling of shame, and changing their behavior, changing their attitude. You know, there's probably a lot of people in prison who don't feel shame. You know, you see a lot of court cases and stuff where, you know, the news reporter says, and he showed no remorse or whatever for murdering this child or something. And those kind of people have no shame. Those are psychopaths in the most extreme, worst case scenario possible. But you water that down a bit, and I think it's far more common than we might like to realize. I have felt shame in the past for things I've done. Like crippling shame and guilt, which is not the same thing, but they overlap massively. And I've, you know, psychologically punished myself, saying, you are a bad person because you did this thing. And then my mental health has taken a toll. But as I self-reflect and look at what happened and the circumstances under which it happened, I don't blame myself. Obviously, I am responsible, but I can acknowledge the circumstances in it and realize that that shame was valid. It's good that I felt that. But then the thing that made me feel this crippling guilt, I never ever did again. Ever. Having done that was actually a good thing, because it, you know, no one died. It wasn't a life or death situation. It was just morally objectionable, let's say. And so having done that, I now know that I don't ever have to do that again. So that's guilt working as it's supposed to. That is a comfort in a way, because if I had done that thing that upset this person so much, and I was just like, meh, whatever, obviously I wouldn't feel bad about it, because it would have no shame for me attached to it. But the fact that it did tells me I'm a relatively decent person at the very least. So there's that. You know, it teaches us life lessons, hopefully. But what is difficult to deal with is when people have that trigger of shame, what they should feel as, oh, I feel bad about this thing, maybe I won't do that in future. People who don't do that, or can't do that, more to the point, they will assume, or maybe they can't handle guilt. Maybe that's the thing. They cannot handle it. They may feel it, but they can't. They're psychologically ill-equipped to handle such heavy negative emotions towards themselves. So they will deflect. It will bounce off them when you said you did this horrible thing, and then they'll deflect, or just say that you're being ridiculous for being upset about this certain thing, or what I did wasn't actually that bad, even though it's your feelings that you're expressing about this thing, right? So I say this thing that you did that upset me, and I'm not saying you are a bad person because of it. I'm saying your actions were bad, and those need to not repeat themselves. To me, this is incredibly simple, but some people can't separate the feeling of you're saying I'm a bad person with you're saying this thing that I did was bad. People who can't self-reflect, again, I'm bringing this up again because it's relevant, people who can't self-reflect will never change, I don't think, without a really, really conscious effort. And people who can't feel guilt, or again, this wiring of guilt is upside down, I don't know if they'll ever really change, unless they get proper therapy and admit to themselves, more importantly, that they have a problem with handling guilt. You know, the first step to addressing a problem is admitting there's a problem in the first place. And if you are not wired properly to handle guilt or shame in the first place, then there's nothing to acknowledge. There's no problem. This is just how I am, right? And it's unfortunately those of us that do have this healthy response to shame, that we're the ones that actually really suffer, because we can see what they're doing or what they're not doing, but they're so clouded by their own ignorance, I guess, that you try and explain to them so many different ways, like your actions are upsetting to me, and it'll never work, because the guilt that they should feel is redirected back at the person, telling them that they upset them, if that makes sense. And so someone with an inability to use shame as a constructive tool for self-improvement, they'll say things or do things, and then people will say, as I've mentioned, that upset me. That's not cool, what you just said or did. That's not a good thing to do or say, or a good attitude. It's not healthy, etc., etc. And they'll just shrug and go, well, that's just how I see it, and that's the end of it. I didn't get any guilt response trigger, so it's obviously your problem, not mine. Which is, again, it's borderline psychotic behavior, like psychopathy in its proper sense, right? If your actions upset someone, it's not your problem. It's not your responsibility how another person feels about what you did or what you said. In these interactions, all you can really do as the other person who's, who does engage with shame properly and understands how the person should feel in our, Christian moral society. What the hell, what are you supposed to do with that? What are you supposed to say? You can't do or say anything because this person is so hell-bent on deflection and not using shame in an appropriate way. But these same people, they will feel shame for the weirdest things. Let's say, so someone like this realizes their shoe's untied, which to most of us would just be, oh, my shoe's untied, I'm going to do it up and carry on with the rest of my day, and that's as far as it goes. Whereas someone with this weird, badly wired guilt system will feel so much shame because it goes overboard, where it's just a tiny thing. But some of these people, I think because they're so focused on the world perceiving them as being perfect or whatever, that they can't handle that little moment of slight inconvenience, yet they will treat someone incredibly badly, and it doesn't have the same effect. And this is what I mean, it's wired wrong. It needs to be relearned. It needs therapy and, training and stuff. Shame isn't bad. Shame is not a bad feeling to have. It feels bad. This is the confusing thing. It feels bad. It feels horrible. But it's good because it's teaching you a lesson. In the same way as, you cut your hand when you're cooking with a knife and you're bleeding. Next time, you're going to be more careful with that knife, aren't you? Because you got a response from your nervous system saying, that was a stupid thing to do. Maybe be a bit more careful in future. It's the exact same thing, just psychologically speaking. So we need shame as a society. In our relationships, we need shame. It stops us from treating people badly. It stops us from doing very, very stupid things and repeating mistakes. That's the main thing. It stops us repeating mistakes. We all make mistakes. But the reason we make mistakes is so we can learn from them. If you have no concept of shame, you are never going to learn from your mistakes. It's as simple as that. And like I said, you don't have to take shame to an extreme because then, there's a balance, right? You don't want to go too overboard because then you're just going to withdraw and not take any risks ever and just sit in a corner in the dark and never do anything. That's not constructive either. And that... If you take that approach, that is going to compound issues because then you're not going to experience anything to learn. Even little children feel shame. It's like inbuilt into us. Empathy is a different thing in its larger scale. But when a child is chastised because they did something bad, because they broke something valuable, or they just behaved inappropriately, or they, bit another child or something, once you tell that child off, they will know. They will understand that that is bad, that I shouldn't do that because the adults don't treat me well when that happens. Okay, breaking it down super simple. This is obvious to anyone, but even little children know that feeling. And so I'm convinced that at some point between childhood and adulthood, a series of bad interactions or bad lessons from maybe parents, I don't know, led to this badly configured guilt system connected to the nervous system. And the nervous system, when trained properly, it is a lifesaver. It is literally a lifesaver. But when it's when it learns bad habits because of bad, maybe parenting, maybe bad school, maybe bad friends, when it learns these things, it's difficult to rewire, but it will compound itself over time if it's not addressed, if it's never dealt with in therapy or whatever. You can come to these conclusions on your own, of course, you can. Depends on your mental constitution, I suppose. But help is out there. You can get therapy for these kind of things. But the problem is, as I mentioned previously, someone with no concept of shame or badly tuned shame response isn't even going to know that there is a problem in the first place. And that compounds itself as well, because then someone will, even if you say to that person, I think you're not responding appropriately or empathetically enough to my informing you that you did a bad thing. You know, the person's not going to respond well to that. And again, they're going to deflect, and it just goes on and on and on and on. So this is a really difficult topic to address with someone who has these issues. And trust me, I've tried over many, many years. And in the end, you just have to give up. Sometimes it's the best thing to do when trying to teach someone that their guilt and shame is not doing what it's supposed to do. They won't listen. You can't teach them that. So therapy is very, very healthy in this situation. But again, you need to acknowledge there's a problem to begin with to actually start doing something about it. It's like a drug addiction, right? If you don't realize you're an alcoholic, you're not going to stop being an alcoholic, right? So thank you for listening. If you have any thoughts, please leave them in the comments below. I'll be glad to read them. Anyway, moving on.